Several of you remember Norm and Wanda Laverick. Well, as I'm teaching this series on seniors serving, I think of Norm and Wanda from time to time. They were a great couple. I know a number of you didn't really get to know them very well, but Norm and Wanda were an interesting couple. First of all, they were retired and they served until their strength gave out. And what I mean by that was, like, for instance, here at the church, they were our janitors. They were the ones that did a lot of work. They came in and they cleaned the church. They vacuumed stuff, cleaned the bathrooms every week. They would mow the lawns. They just took care of a lot of stuff that way. And the way they figured it, it wasn't that they were thinking, oh, no one else is doing it, but they thought, hey, we've got the time, we can do it, and we like doing that kind of stuff. So they did it, and they did it very cheerfully. In fact, Wanda always kind of amused me because Wanda um, wanted to come in, and we had these pews for a while, but before these, we had these longer gray pews that just sat right in the middle, and Wanda would oil them. She would get, what is that, Murphy's oil or the English, I can't remember what kind she used, but she would oil them and then wipe them down so they wouldn't get your clothes oily. But what was really cool, if you stood on one end and jumped, you could sit and slide all the way down because she had them oiled. But they were good people. We really appreciated them. One of the things that I really appreciated about them, and especially about Norm, was that Norm was a good counselor for me. When we first started here, which was 21 years ago, I was, 31, 32, something like that. And I would go to Norm for counsel. Now, Norm had never been in the ministry. He never had any formal Bible training. In fact, he worked for Shears when it used to be Shears for a long time in the parts department. But Norm was a believer, and Norm had wisdom. He developed wisdom over his years. And I could trust his advice. Not that I always agreed with it. There were a couple times on a couple of different things that I didn't necessarily agree with his particular advice. But then I'd have to look into, okay, why is he saying that, though? What is he getting at? And then there's something in there for me to learn from. I remember a number of times when he would say, and because he also served as one of our deacons, he'd say, well, Pastor, I think it'd be good if we, and then he would share something like that. Or there were other times when I asked him, I said, Norm, what would you think if we did this or tried this? He says, oh, I don't know, Pastor. He said, I wouldn't do that, and here's why. And he'd share his reasoning. And more often than not, I was very happy that I took his advice. He was just a good counselor in that thing. I remember one way that they served. We had a family that attended here back in the early years when I first came called the Grazianos. And some of you might even know a couple of them. But at one point, they were going through some real financial difficulties. And at one point, the well on their house quit. And they were thinking, oh, no, you got a well problem. What are you going to do? You're talking thousands of dollars to go and fix that. Well, they had shared that with me, and I was praying for them. And I had mentioned it to Norm. And then a couple of weeks later, I found out that their well problem was fixed. And so I asked him, I said, well, what happened? He said, well, it was the strangest thing. This is Mr. Graziano. I believe his name was Tom. But he said, it's the strangest thing. We were there one day, and one day Norm just showed up and said, I was passing by. Yeah, right. I was just passing by, and I heard that you were having some well problems. So I thought, if you don't mind, would you mind if I just look to see what's going on? He said, I've had to fix a couple wells in my time. And so they took him and they showed him, and Norm just looked around. He said, you know what, right here's the problem. And they went and they paid $1.70 at Ace Hardware for a part to fix it, and their well was fixed. It was a little float thing or something of that nature. But he was just wanting to serve in different ways. Now, Norm would never, ever have preached. He would never, ever have stood up and spoke in front of a group, and that's fine. But Norm used what he had. They had time. They used their time. They had abilities like for doing some of the things outside, that kind of a thing. I remember him cutting down some trees and stuff out here. Just different stuff like that. He just used what he had to serve the Lord. And I appreciated that from him. And like I also said, he used his wisdom. He had wisdom. Now, he wasn't the type that would barge in and say, here, let me share with you what I know. But if you asked, he would share it. And he had good wisdom. Well, with that in mind, it reminds me of a person that I want to look at today. I want to look at someone called Jethro. Now, right away, some of you thought Beverly Hillbillies, didn't you? when I said Jethro. In fact, even Paul mentioned that. Paul said that today. I said, yeah, his uncle's the one that found oil, shooting for oil. But no, that's the wrong Jethro. We're not going to talk about him. Instead, we're going to talk about another Jethro that's listed in the scriptures who was actually the father-in-law of Moses. And he served the Lord. And I want us to look at that today. He served as a senior. If you're in the book of Exodus, turn to Exodus chapter 18. And I'm going to divide this into half, I think. I'm going to read the first half, and we'll deal with that. And then we'll read the second half once we get to that. But this chapter is it's usually broken up into two halves, and we'll look at it that way. Exodus chapter 18, beginning at verse 1. And Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And the name of the other was Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife, meaning Moses' son and his wife, to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the Mount of God. Now he had said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. By the way, where they are right now, they've left Egypt, they've already gone through the Red Sea, and they're on their way to Mount Sinai. They haven't even gotten the 10 Commandments yet, but that's coming up. In fact, this is Exodus 18, and Exodus 20 is when they get the 10 Commandments. So they're real close to that. Verse 9. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses, father-in-law, before God. Now, we're going to stop there. We'll pick up verse 13 just a little bit later. But I want to look at this. Now, normally, when someone deals with this passage, in fact, I saw it this week when I looked at a number of different sources that were dealing with this particular passage, there's pretty much a traditional outline that is used. And the first outline is verses 1 through 12 is just the setting. It gives a setting for what's going on. And then verses 13 through 27 gives Jethro's advice. Jethro's going to give some advice to Moses about the way in which Moses is leading. Moses is going to heed his advice, and it's really going to help him. Okay? But they normally just focus on that. 1 through 12 is the setting. 13 through 27 is Jethro's advice. However, I think they're missing something really important by doing that. What happens with a lot of these guys, if you're reading the commentators on it, is they'll just brush over verses 1 through 12 and say, well, here he is, and he brought Moses' wife and sons back to him, and now here's the advice that he gives them. They spend all their time on that. But I think there's a lot more to the story here. I think there's a lot more to Jethro's story, as a matter of fact, if you don't gloss over verses 1 through 12. And we're going to look at that. If you'll see, I've got the first point is Jethro's family wisdom. He's going to share. He's going to come and maybe not so much share, but he's going to practice some family wisdom that's going to be extremely helpful. So we're going to look at that. As we do, I want to look at a couple things. First of all, is Jethro a believer? Who is this Jethro anyway? It said in verse 1 that Jethro is the priest of Midian. Is this guy a pagan? Is this guy an idol worshiper? Because if you were to look at the religions of the Midianites, you'll see that they were idol worshipers and so forth. Well, what is it? Who is Jethro? Is he? Well, that's something I think we got to consider for a minute. Is he this idolatrous person that maybe later was saved? In fact, you get to verses 10 and 11, and he actually worships with Moses. And Moses' leadership from the nation come in, and they allow him to offer sacrifices before God. Did he get saved? One of the commentators I was reading this week felt that that's when he got saved, was verses 10 and 11, after he saw what God had done. Is that what happened? I don't think so. I think that there's more to this story. And actually, if you want a fun study this out sometime. Maybe go online and punch in, who is Jethro, the priest of Midian, and see what you get. Now, you got to use discernment, because I did that, and I got all kinds of stuff. I even got some really weird, wacky stuff that I don't even want to take the time to go into right now. But at any rate, you're going to see that. Who is he? Was he an idolater? I don't think so. And I'll explain why in a minute. One of the issues also is that there's a problem with the language. You know that the old ancient Hebrew is an ancient language. It's not spoken anymore. And there's lots of different issues on how you deal with this. And there are some words that are hard to actually define. In fact, when I read it, I said, Jethro, the priest of Midian. Did any of your translations say anything other than priest? There in verse 1, chapter 18, verse 1. Did anybody say anything other than the word priest? Because some translations will say the word prince. And they say Jethro, the prince of Midian. And the reason is I went and looked up that word. I looked it up from an ancient standpoint. It can be translated either way. Now, more often than not, to be fair, it is translated priest, but it also is fair to translate that word as prince, as someone who's an important person there. So it could actually be saying that Jethro was one of the leaders there in this area where the Midianites lived. That's a possibility, but I think there's even bigger things going on there. My question is was Jethro already a believing Gentile? And this is where, actually, I spent more time studying this than even studying what I'm going to deal with on the rest of the message, because it just captivated my thoughts. But I want you to think about this for a minute. Who were the people of God before Abraham came along? When God chose Abraham, and then God said, I am going to bless you and your family line. And then God started blessing. And then God blessed Isaac, his son. And then God blessed Jacob, his son, after him. And then the Israelites ended up going into captivity. They haven't even received all the stuff for being Israelites yet. They haven't received all their laws. They haven't received all their rules. They haven't gotten any of that stuff yet. Well, maybe a little bit of teaching from Moses, but not a lot. So with that said, who were the believers that were alive on planet Earth during that time? When God finally chose Abraham, the end of Genesis 11 into Genesis chapter 12, were there any other believers before then? And the answer to that question apparently is yes, there were many other believers. Now, Adam and Eve, were they Jewish? No, they weren't. When Adam and Eve started having sons, we know that Cain and his sons apparently walked away from the Lord. They weren't having anything to do with the Lord. But Seth, their third son that they had, and his family line, we see a number of them that are following God. Remember last week, or a couple weeks ago, we talked about Enoch, and then we talked about Methuselah, remember him? And then it went to Noah. Well, were they Jews? None of those guys were Jews. They were all, believe it or not, Gentiles, even though they were going to lead, physically speaking, to the Jewish race down the road. But they weren't Jews yet, because that whole race hadn't even developed. Well, then you had Noah, and then you had the flood, and then Noah's family spread out. Well, who were the believers after that? There were people within their family lines who were believers. We don't have all their names, but we can see their posterity passing down the faith. And the reason I would say that is by the time you get to Abraham in chapter 11, Abraham already believes in God. And apparently some of his family already believe in God. There were people who were following God before that time. And they weren't Jews, but they were following the God of the Bible, the God of creation. They were following him. Let me give you another example. At one point during Abraham's ministry, or when Abraham was going along doing the things that God had him doing leading up to the Jewish race, Abraham comes up upon a person who is called Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was the king of Salem. The Jeruhites, I believe their names were, lived there, by the way. Think about that for a minute. Jerusalem. The king of Salem, he was actually the king of what would become Jerusalem later on. But they called it Salem at the time. But not only was he a king, he was a priest. And as Moses refers to him, he refers to him as the priest of the Most High God. He was the priest of the God of the Bible, but he wasn't Jewish. There were still believers on the earth who were following the creating God, even though they weren't Jewish. God has always had a remnant of people who were his followers. Now, he's going to start working through the nation of Israel, and he's going to start doing things through the nation of Israel. But with that vein happening, God has always had believers over here, too. Now, those believers will submit to God's revelation. They will submit to the fact that God is working through the Israelite nation. They don't try to fight against that, and that's one of the signs, too, that they're true believers. But you had anyway, Melchizedek, who is a believer. The book of Job. We know that Job was a believer, and you read all that. When did Job take place? Job took place, some people think that Job is one of the earliest stories in the Bible. Even though you find it later on in the Old Testament near the book of Psalms, Job took place before Abraham. Job is a believer before Abraham ever came on the scene. Again, more evidence that there were people who were believers that were not Israelites, and they were following the God of the Bible. They had revelation, whether it's passed down by word of mouth. I mean, you look at Job's faith. You read the book of Job. He had a deep, intricate faith. Where did he get all that knowledge and information from? Well, from the people before him who had passed down their faith, but they weren't Israelites. So my point in all this is there were plenty of people who were believers in God before, or maybe I should say outside of the line of Israel. Now, are there other examples of people who were believers in the God of the Bible even though they were not Israelites? Yes, there are. You go to the New Testament, you can see a number of them as well. Remember the centurion? It was Cornelius, I think it was, who was a believer in God, and he followed God, but he was not a Jew, and he did not become a proselyte because he was a Roman centurion. There was Lydia. We talk about her. She became the first believer in the church in Europe, actually. But before that, she was already a follower of God. And you could just go on. There's a number of stories. Even Jesus came across that woman with the issue of blood. You remember that story? And she wasn't a Jew. In fact, Jesus even said to her, he never challenged her faith. Her faith was real. But he said to her, he said, I'm here to minister to the Jews. And then the lady said to him, yeah, but even the little children can enjoy the crumbs that fall off the table. Or even the little dogs can enjoy the crumbs that fall from the children's plate onto the table. And Jesus was amazed because he understood that she got this whole faith thing. And so he did, in fact, heal her and bless her. Even though she wasn't a Jew, that wasn't what his ministry was about at that point in time. But he healed her anyway. So there have always been people along that way. I am suggesting that Jethro is one of those people. That Jethro is one of those people, even though it says he was a priest of Midian. Again, might that be that he was a prince of Midian, but it also might mean that he was a priest there in the land of Midian. And that's very possible as well. Now, I admit I get a little worried when I'm thinking of things like this and that not a lot of other people do. I'm thinking, am I running down a bunny trail that doesn't really matter, doesn't really make sense? But as I started studying it this week, I started finding more and more examples of people who believe the same thing. Lynn has the Nelson Study Bible. I found in her notes they said the exact same thing. They said that Jethro is like Melchizedek, who was a Gentile believer apart from these things. I found a number of other sources that started saying the same thing. I believe he was already a believer. Now, I know I'm kind of belaboring this point, and maybe you're wondering why is this point so important. Well, my point is this, is that Jethro was already a believer, and he was an aged believer. He's Moses' father-in-law. Moses is over 80 years old at this point when he's leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. And Jethro was probably over 100 years old himself. But he's still serving the Lord. And he was known in his area as a good man who served the Lord. In fact, do you know what his name means? If you went back to chapter 2, you'll see that they refer to Jethro by two different names. When Moses first meets him as the priest of Midian in Exodus chapter 2, he's called Ruel. You know what Ruel means? Whenever you see in the Old Testament the E-L, El, that usually means God. Like Bethel, Beth means house, El means God, the house of God. Well, Ruel, Ru means friend. He's called the friend of God. And then his name, Jethro itself, may not have even been a name. That may have been a title because it means his excellency. His excellency, the friend of God. He was known around there as being a friend of God. Now, someone even suggested that when Moses had to defend his daughters against those shepherds that wouldn't let him water their sheep, that those shepherds were Midianites, and they may have looked down on him because his religion wasn't the same as theirs. Actually kind of makes sense. I mean, it all kind of fits together. But still, here's a man that had spiritual life. He was alive spiritually speaking. He had faith. And God was working in his heart, and God was doing things with him. That's important because I think it's going to come into play when we look at what he actually did. And we're looking here in verses 1 through 12. I think you're going to see that he's going to exercise some real spiritual wisdom, some spiritual maturity, because he's going to recognize the importance of family. Okay? You see this in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 18. It shows that he is coming back to Moses, and he's bringing Moses' wife and his 2 sons. Now, why does he have to do that? Well, it's because earlier in the story, Moses had sent them back. Remember, Moses came from Egypt, fleeing Pharaoh after he got in trouble about that murder. And he came and he met these people. He married Zipporah, and he lived and worked with them for 40 years. And now God is sending him back after he saw the burning bush and so forth. God's sending him back to rescue the children of Israel. And some conjecture that maybe Moses sent his wife and sons back because he knew it was going to be a dangerous time. That's a good possibility. Very possible that he's sending them back for there. But you know, that might not be the reason, actually. Actually, there were some struggles between Moses and his wife. One of the struggles was when they went to circumcise one of the sons. She didn't like it. And there was a little bit of a tussle there, so I'm not real sure. Is it possible that they had struggles? Maybe it's cultural struggles between the Midianite culture that she grew up in and the Jewish culture. Even though she was apparently a believer, there's still cultural differences. You can be believers, that's great, but there's still things that you might struggle with. Or again, the whole safety issue. We're just not sure. But at any rate, he sent them back. But here's the question, and I read someone this week that asked this, and it just made me stop and say, what? He said, how come Moses hasn't sent for his wife and sons to come back yet? They've actually been out of Egypt for a little while now. And they haven't been traveling all that far where they are. Moses could have sent for his father-in-law to bring his wife and kids back. How come he hasn't done it? I mean, we're talking months of time here. And Moses has been busy leading, and he hasn't asked for his wife and sons to come back. How come? I'm not real sure. Actually, I did read a whole bunch of different reasons that some people thought, and there's lots of things that they would discuss. But someone pointed this out. He said, we need to be careful as believers that we don't practice a thing called the pious bias. And what that means is because Moses is a great leader, and because Moses accomplished a lot for God, we let him off the hook and assume everything he's doing is good. But do you know any person that everything they do is always good and they never make mistakes and they never have any sinful attitudes or anything like that? I don't know anyone like that. We need to be careful that we don't treat Moses as if he's some sort of a god. He's not. He's a human being just like the rest of us. And so Moses is going to struggle with things from time to time. And this may, in fact, be an example of where he is struggling with that. So don't let him off the hook and assume. And some people do that. You read some commentators and they'll say, oh, Moses was willing to give up his family life in order to serve God in this case. Does God ever ask anyone to give up their family life to serve him? No, never. You're just not going to see that. I mean, unless he takes their life or something, but that's a totally different thing. But is it possible that Moses got so busy in serving the Lord and so busy in taking them back that he's allowing his family life to slip here? I actually think that's a possibility. We'll see it a little more later when Jethro has to confront him on the second thing, talk to him about it. But right now, let's just ask this question. Is it possible that Moses is a victim of his own success? And that because of his own success, they're leading these Israelites out. There's probably close to 2 million Israelites, by the way, that have left Egypt and are going. And Moses is involved in all the leadership part of it. You're going to see in a little bit that he wasn't doing it in a very smart way, and so it was just taxing his time, and he was allowing his family to be squeezed out. Now, some people would say, oh, it doesn't matter as long as you're doing good things for God. You can do that. No, you can't. It doesn't matter how much good you do. As a husband, your first ministry is toward your wife and toward your children. It has to be. It's always been that way. And if you let that slip, you create problems. By the way, there's a number of leaders in Israel's history that did let it slip, and they created problems. One of the greatest prophets was Samuel. Samuel was a great prophet. God used him to do a lot of wonderful things. But when Samuel's sons came along, it said because Samuel did not do a good job of parenting them, when they tried to make his sons prophets, they caused problems because they weren't spiritual. He didn't even help disciple his own sons to walk with the Lord, and they became scoundrels. Even though he was a great prophet. No, you just ought not to be doing that. Well, Moses was apparently doing that, and Jethro recognized it. Now, the point that I'm going to get at here with Jethro is a senior citizen. We're talking about we as seniors serving the Lord in different ways. He's a senior citizen, but he's not going to just sit on the side. He is willing to do some things with the wisdom God has given him, with the skill set that God has given him, and he's going to allow himself to be served and to be used in this way. And he's going to begin here with Moses. Instead of saying, you know what, I'm a grandpa and I love having my grandkids here. Some of you as grandparents, you love having your grandkids around. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, and I'm not talking about, there are some grandparents that say, oh, these kids are so loud. And I don't mean that. I'm talking about grandparents that you just love having your grandkids around. Jethro could have been that way and said, I love these boys. I'm going to keep them around. Instead of being a dad who loved his daughter and said, okay, if Moses wants to stay, well, I just love having him here. You know, and I have to think, by the way, he might have been a widower at this point in time. And I have to think that if Whitney's husband was off doing something else, I would love to have Whitney and her kids there with us. Stay as long as you want. I'm good with that. But Jethro didn't do that. Instead of doing that, he said, you know what? You're his wife. You need to be with him. You're his children. You need to be with him. And he needs to be with you. He needs to be ministering to this wife. He needs to be ministering to these children. Jethro recognized the value of family. And so he did something about it. Even above and beyond his own wants, his own desires, he said, you know what? You guys need to be with them. It always bugs me when I see families that take sides. Now, I know that there's different issues that can happen within families, and sometimes the in-law spouse can be a bad person. I realize that happens. But a lot of times it's just a matter that you're just defending your own child, and you take sides with them, and you enable them to take sides against their spouse, and you actually wreck their family. You can't be doing that. And Jethro recognized that. So he reunited them. He brought them back. That's why I'm coming. And so he brought their family together. I believe Jethro was using his clout and using his position, but also using his wisdom to minister to this family. And in the end, he's ministering to the nation of Israel. Moses is going to be a better minister to the nation of Israel if he's got his home life together and his home life working. And Moses is going to be more relaxed. Moses is going to be more fulfilled. He's going to be all those things if he's got his family life together where it ought to be. So that's the first thing that Jethro did. Now, what's the next thing that he did? And we haven't read through that. But Jethro is going to show some leadership wisdom. And again, this is where most of the commentators go right to, but we'll go to that anyway. Look at verse 13 of chapter 18 in Exodus. It says, and so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And by the way, what he means by judge the people is Moses kind of sat like a judge would in a court of law, and someone comes up and says, look, I've had these 2 donkeys. They've been mine for years. We use them to farm. We use them to do all kinds of stuff. Well, they got loose the other day, and they ran away, and this guy over here took them, and he's not giving them back to us. He's saying that they're his donkeys now. Moses, help us out here. And then Moses would actually judge and say, you need to give them back, or something to that effect. That was the type of stuff that Moses was doing. He was setting up judging the people in that way. Look at verse 13. It says, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. Again, you're talking about a group of about 2 million people. There's going to be lots of little things like that going on. And the people would line up in the morning and wait and hope that Moses could get to their case. Verse 14. So when Moses' father-in-law saw that what he did for the people, he said, what is this thing that you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me and inquire of God. Get what Moses is saying. This is what the people want. He's doing what the people want, which isn't necessarily bad in itself, but let's keep going. Verse 16. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and the other, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own land. Well, let's look at what Jethro did here. First of all, Jethro recognized the tyranny of the urgent. Have you heard that phrase before? The tyranny of the urgent? Chuck Swindoll wrote a book about that a number of years ago. The tyranny of the urgent. And what that means is there's so many things that need to be done now that the most important things get squeezed out. That's what he means by the tyranny of the urgent. Well, this has to be done now, and therefore I have to do it. Meanwhile, there's something else you're supposed to be doing that you're not doing because you're taking care of what has to be done now. And that's something that apparently Jethro recognized. Now, what was it that Moses was called to do? Think about this for a minute. What did God call Moses to do? When you think back to the stories where God saw him through the burning bush and other times when God spoke to him or led him along in different ways, what was it that God wanted Moses to do? Did God want Moses to solve individual problems of this people that he took out of Egypt? Or did God want Moses to lead the nation? There's a difference, you know. God wanted Moses to lead the nation. He wanted him to be a leader. And instead, his leadership is being hindered right now because of all these smaller things. And I think that's what Jethro noticed about his family, too. Moses' family was being hindered because of all the things that Moses was trying to do. Now, the scriptures teach that Moses was a very humble person, and apparently he was a very nice person as well. Moses probably genuinely cared about these people, the Israelites, and he wanted to help them solve their problems. And he wanted to help them get it right. He wanted justice to prevail. He wanted to be as helpful as he could be. But he was allowing that to squeeze out the most important things. He was supposed to lead. And that was an issue. So what did Jethro suggest here? First of all, he encouraged Moses to get back to the important things. If you'll see in verses 19 and 20, he tells Moses, he said, your work, first of all, is to seek God's help with the most difficult things. All right, we recognize there's some things that are really tricky. You're going to need to seek God's help. You're the spiritual leader. You're the one who needs to seek God's help. You need to do that. But then you also, Moses, need to be teaching the people God's statutes and God's laws. That's what you're really supposed to be doing. You need to be showing them how to walk, how to live their faith. You need to show them the work that God has called them to do as his people. Moses, that's what you need to be putting your time into, not all of these other things. These other things are preventing you from doing these things that God has done you to do. So Jethro then urges Moses to delegate authority. You need to put other people to work here. You see that in verses 21 and 22. Interestingly, he tells Moses, you know what, Moses, you're not the only one who can do this. He doesn't say it in those words, but that's basically what he's saying. He's saying there are actually other good, wise, righteous men who can help in this leadership. They can help do those things. And so you need to get them and you need to put them in charge of these things. You need to allow them to use their righteousness. You need to allow them to use their wisdom. You need to allow them to use their skill set to help solve some of these problems. You need to do that. They can handle the ordinary stuff. And again, when something really big comes along and you need to handle it, then you go and handle it. And you need to do that. Yeah, don't we see life kind of set up that way anyway? I mean, look at the United States. Think of our court system, if you will. Aren't our courts set up like that? Does the Supreme Court hear a case about a local shoplifter from Kmart here in Great? No, they don't. That's the local courts, the local people. They handle those things. And then if it's a little bigger, it'll go to a circuit court. And a little bigger, it might go to the state court, maybe even the state Supreme Court. And if it was really huge, dealing with a big topic, then it would go to the Supreme Court, something like that. So yeah, we actually see those ideas at work, if you will. Now, I think Jethro was also careful here. Jethro isn't saying, look, I know how to handle this. Do it the way I'm doing and everything will turn out right. In verse 23, he says, and if God so commands. See, Jethro even recognized God is still in control. Moses, I'm going to offer you this advice, but you still need to determine if this is what God wants you to do or not. And if God does want you to do this, well, then things should work out. And things should be better. So Moses, you need to consider these things and serve in that way. Now, is there a New Testament application for this whole idea? Think about, if you will, Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, the new church was just getting started in Jerusalem. Remember, they had over 3,000 people get saved that first day when Peter preached on the street, and they've added more people since then. Well, in Acts chapter 6, they had a situation arise. What had happened is the church was taking care of the people within its own church that needed help, and especially the widows. They didn't have all the government programs back then that we might have now. And so the widows are being taken care of, and they were actually using their funds to help feed some of the widows and stuff that were in there. Well, a problem came up because some of the Jews who were from Greek areas felt that their widows were being neglected, while the Jewish widows, maybe the ones who were originally from Jerusalem, they were getting fed. Something's going on here, and it caused a problem. And they said, we need to do something. And they raised I don't want to say they raised a ruckus. They started debating the issue. Well, what did the apostles say? The apostles were Peter, James, and John, and all of those guys that had followed Jesus. They were now the leaders in the early church. What did they say? What they said was, you know what? You need to choose men who are wise, who love God, and could take care of this issue. They need to take care of this issue, but look at why they said. They said, because it's not for us to be waiting on tables. We need to spend our time teaching the Word of God, praying, and leading in that way. They're doing the exact same thing that Moses was told to do. So it is, in fact, a New Testament principle. Now, with all that said, what I'm really most interested in, I didn't intend today on teaching on family values, although that certainly comes up in the story. I didn't even want to teach on leadership values, although that came up. And if I ever get asked to go preach to like a Bible college where these guys are preparing for ministry, I'm going to use this passage someday, if that ever happens. It probably won't, but if it does, I'm going to use that passage. But that's not even the most important. What I wanted to focus on is look at Jethro. Serve the Lord. He's probably over 100 years old, and he's serving the Lord. Now, does he have the energy to go out and do all the physical parts of ministry? No, probably not. Does he have the skill set to go out and take care of those? I don't know if he can or not, maybe not. But one thing he does have, and he's willing to use it, and that is he has some wisdom. He has some insight, and he's going to use it. And he's willing to step in where other people might say, I'm just going to stay back. Think about this. Jethro comes in, and Moses is leading this group of 1.5 million to 2 million people. And Jethro steps in, and now he's going to start offering advice. Jethro could have said, you know what, I'm not the leader. That's them. I'm just going to back off and let them do it. Hopefully they'll figure it out. No, he's not going to do that. Instead, Jethro's going to say, well, have you considered this? Now, Jethro is very direct with Moses, but I believe he's also very constructive. I believe his goal wasn't to slap Moses around and say, come on, dummy. You're not using your time very good. Yeah, he wasn't doing it that way. Instead, he was giving Moses some ideas on, wouldn't it be wiser to try to do it this way? Jethro's not even the leader there, but he's willing to offer some advice. He's willing to offer some wisdom. He's willing to serve the Lord that way. And I guess it reminds me that all of us have something to serve the Lord. All of us can do different things to try to serve the Lord. And some of us, maybe we're well past retirement age, and I don't have the energy to do all the other things I used to do in church, and that's okay. You still have stuff to offer. You still have wisdom to offer. Norm and Wanda Laverick did that. And Norm, even when he got to where he was struggling with other things and he was struggling with physical issues and so forth, I could still go to him with things and say, you know what, Norm, here's something I've been wondering about. And he could offer some advice, offer some help. We all can do that. We need to not check out. We need to make sure that we're being helpful somehow, some way. You need to make sure you're being constructive. If you'll notice what he didn't just sit around and complain and say, this is dumb, I can't believe they're doing it that way. Instead, he was being constructive. He was trying to build up. You know, don't you think it would be better if you did it this way? Moses, not only will it help you, but these poor people have to stand in line all day. It would help them too. So he's being constructive. He's trying to solve problems with the wisdom that he had. He's being involved. And I guess that's the issue. We all need to be involved. What is the church? The church is not a pastor. The church is not a pastor and deacons. The church is not a pastor and deacons and Sunday school teachers. The church is the body of Christ. The church is all of us who know the Lord Jesus as our Savior. And we need to be involved. We need to be involved in helping and bettering and improving. We need to be doing that. We need to continue serving even when we're seniors and we think we're beyond it. The world might look at you as you're beyond your prime and you're not worth much anymore, but the church doesn't look at you like that. The Lord Jesus doesn't look at you like that. You still got a lot to offer, and we need to continue serving that way. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for the story of Jethro, Ruel, the friend of God. Thank you that he served you even at a time when others might have said, I'm just going to be quiet and go my way. Lord, help us to serve as he did. Help us, Lord, to recognize that you've given us experiences for a purpose. There's a reason why you allowed us to endure things we did in our younger year so that we could acquire wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom on how those things can be done better and how they can accomplish more for your glory. Lord, use us to accomplish your work. I'm praying this in Jesus' name.